Bruce Mao referred to something that you're about to hear from. He referred to the city dividends. This was, I think, a brilliant concept developed by Joe Cortright and Carol Coletta a number of years ago that is basically premised on the fact that every single one of you is going to go back to your cities and deal with some pretty big challenges. And the challenge you have, whether you're the mayor of a city like Milwaukee, or whether you head a foundation in Cleveland, or whether you run an economic development organization or a human service organization in Asheville or Greensboro, is that you need to keep people motivated, focused, and accelerated your work. And how do you do that? We think it's by creating something called a city dividend that says that you take a goal, you do some research and show what the economic impact on your city and your region will be that produces an economic dividend, and you get people to say, if we just do something literally small that moves the needle, it'll have a huge economic impact. And our best known and best developed dividend, thanks to the support of the Lumina and Kresge foundations, is the talent dividend. It was first announced officially back in 2011, although the work preceded that. And we have now developed a network of more than 60 cities around the country who are sharing the best ideas and stories and case studies for making their cities smarter. Now, when we think of smarter, we often think of the kinds of things we'll hear from Anil Menon later this morning. But I'm talking about the fact that Joe Cortright's research and the research of Ed Glazer and others shows that if you measure the success of a city on one measure, and that's per capita income or the average earnings of your residents, that the single most important thing you can do is to increase the educational attainment level of your people who live and work in your city. And that can be measured in a number of ways, but one of the best ways to measure it is by the number of 2-year and 4-year degrees. And so, as you know, next fall we'll be giving a $1 million prize, thanks to Kresge and Lumina, to the city in our network that increases its educational attainment rate the fastest over the next year, over the past 3 years really, by just, in many cases, just a few percentage points. This morning, we're announcing another one of those dividends in our city dividend portfolio. It's called the green dividend. You've heard about it before. Joe Cortright has talked about it before, but today we're actually giving you a report. And to present that report, Joe Cortright.
Thank you, Lee. And I have to say, and I worked with Carol in developing some of the city dividends, that the idea behind the dividend has really emerged from the conversations that happen at these meetings. And it's really the dialogue with communities, with cities around the country, and the insights that we gain from these conversations that you have that provide the basis for the dividends. And we hope that the dividends give you a basis for talking about cities and the role of cities in solving important and national problems. I was struck by something that Doug DeVos said in his remarks, which I think is really core to CEOs for cities. He said that the civic leaders here in Grand Rapids believed in their cities and wanted to be part of the solution. And I think if you had to boil CEOs for cities down to just a couple of things, you would say cities are the solution. And I think everybody in this room understands that. We understand it implicitly. But we have to convince others of it. And the role of the dividends is to give folks a tangible way of expressing why cities are the solution and how it can produce real economic benefits for people. So I'm very pleased today, as Lee said, to give you the printed version of the Green Dividend Report. We previewed it for you in previous years, but now you have something tangible that hopefully you can hand out to others, and they will find persuasive as something that describes what the Green Dividend is and how it works. So with that, and if the folks in AV will help me out here, I'll go on to the presentation and tell you a little bit about the Green Dividend project. That's terrific. And if you can turn my monitor on here in front so that I can see the presentation too without showing everybody the back of my head, which could be an improvement, we'll talk about the Green Dividend. Basically, there are 4 pieces to the Green Dividend presentation today. First of all, I want to talk about the quantification of the green dividend, that we have calculated that if we can reduce driving in the United States in each of the largest metropolitan areas by about 1 mile per person per day, that produces a net economic gain to the people who live in those cities of $31 billion a year. So it's not insignificant. Then second, I'll talk about how the market is driving change in the United States. That fortunately there are important forces behind the green dividend that are pushing and that can give us the opportunity to move forward. I'll talk about some of the specific ways, and you know some of them, that cities can help achieve the green dividend. In fact, doing what cities do best, bringing people together, eliminating the distance between people, is a critical way that cities yield the green dividend, that they are in fact the solution. And then finally, there's good news, there's a bonus here too for the folks who aren't persuaded just by the dollar numbers, but we see a real improvement in traffic levels and travel times in cities that are achieving the green dividend. So those are the 4 points that I'll cover briefly, and that it's really an outline, a synopsis of what's in the publication that we've handed out to you. So how did we come up with this number of about $31 billion for the green dividend? Briefly, we're taking a small bite out of the huge amount of money that Americans are now having to spend for gasoline. Just a decade ago, we were spending about $100 billion a year as a nation on gasoline. Now we're spending close to $500 billion a year on gasoline. Now, we all know that individually, how it's affected us and when we fill up, but when you add it together for the country as a whole, it is, as they say, real money. And that's where the opportunity comes, if we can reduce our gasoline consumption by driving less, to get additional money in consumers' pockets that they can spend on other things that they value. And we compute, roughly speaking, that reducing driving in the United States by 1 mile per person per day, from its current level of about 25 miles per person to about 24 miles per person per day, we would produce additional income to the households in the 51 largest US metropolitan areas of about $31 billion a year. And the math behind this is pretty simple. You just take the 1 mile per person per day, the roughly 50 cents a mile that it costs to operate a vehicle, so it's the fuel as well as the depreciation and operating maintenance expense of the vehicle, times 365 days a year, times the roughly 167 million people in the 51 largest metropolitan areas, that works out to about $31 billion. And our 50 cents per mile estimate is actually fairly conservative. It's representative of the average vehicle in the fleet. Some cars and vehicles, as we know, are much more expensive to operate than that. So that's the math behind the green dividend. What's the economic force that's powering it? And briefly, there are two key economic forces that are helping cities to realize the green dividend. The first is the market force of the push of these higher prices. Nobody's happy to be paying more for fuel, and people are constantly looking for ways to reduce their fuel bill. And cities can offer them a solution, as I'll talk about that. The other thing, and we all know this is really critical, is that cities are increasingly attractive as places to live. There's been a sea change in American attitudes about urban living. And these two factors put together are what can help cities to drive the green dividend. As I mentioned, the cost of gasoline has gone up sharply. And the thing I want to emphasize here is, even after you adjust for the improved fuel economy of the vehicles that people are driving today, the cost of gasoline is much higher. So yes, people are buying more fuel-efficient vehicles, but on a per-mile basis, after we adjust for fuel economy changes, it still costs almost 3 times as much to drive a mile today, just in terms of the fuel, as it did before. So yes, more fuel-efficient vehicles are a good thing, but still people are very much prompted by economic incentives to reduce how far they drive. And we're seeing that in people's behavior. Peak driving in the United States actually happened about 8 years ago. And what this chart shows you is the number of miles per person per day that the average American, so this is urban and rural, drove for basically the last 3.5 decades. And you can see all throughout the era of the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, driving was increasing year in and year out. That slowed down in the early part of the last decade, and the peak year, as I noted, was about 2005. And since then, driving has continued to decline. And that's a trend that we expect to continue, particularly if cities are successful in the ways that I'll describe in a few minutes. And the other thing that I want to mention is a lot of people kind of thought this might be a temporary phenomenon, that this decline in driving was purely related to the serious recession that we experienced in the United States. But that's not true. When we look back at other recessions, yes, the rate of driving slowed down, but it rebounded really quickly. If you look at this very faint line at the bottom of the chart here, that's the change in driving in the United States over the period since the end of the last decade. And you can see that even as the economy has recovered, and that's this faint line here, these are the numbers of months since the end of the recession, even as the economy has recovered, even as we have added millions of jobs, per capita driving in the United States has continued to go down. So this is not a short-run phenomenon that's somehow related to that recession. It's a long-term shift in behaviors, a fundamental change in the way Americans are getting around. And that's fueled by generational change. Young people who are coming of age today have a fundamentally different relationship to technology, and that includes technology with wheels and technology with electrons. And that they use that technology very differently and they travel very differently. We know that young adults are driving less, they're driving later, they're owning fewer vehicles, and they're increasingly drawn to places where they don't have to rely on vehicles so much, cities and great urban neighborhoods. And when we look at VMT, that's vehicle miles traveled, across the demographic spectrum, it's declining essentially for all groups, but it's declining most sharply among young adults. And that, we think, is a leading indicator of behavior, not just for the next few years, but these folks who drive less as young adults will drive less as they get older as well. And the other thing we know from the work that we've done in Young and Restless as part of CEOs for Cities is that talented young people are increasingly moving to the close-in urban neighborhoods of the largest metropolitan areas in the United States. In fact, our research shows that the number of 25 to 34-year-olds with a four-year degree is increasing twice as fast in those close-in urban neighborhoods, that is, urban neighborhoods within 3 miles of the central business district, as it is in the rest of those large metropolitan areas, the area outside the urban core. So cities are very attractive for reasons that we all know, and I'll talk a little bit now about cities as the solution, because this isn't just about somehow driving less, eating your peas, and doing without. It's the fact that cities, when they work well, provide people with really meaningful alternatives, better ways to get around, more things close at hand, and a lifestyle that's both convenient and stimulating. And as a result, when cities work well, people don't have to drive as much, they spend less money on driving, and they have more money to spend on all the other things that they care about, including maybe Lee drinking last night at what's now the beer city in the United States. So the first thing we know is that folks, particularly in cities, and particularly younger people, are owning fewer automobiles, that there's more car-free living and less car living as lifestyles. And cities, when they work well, really enable this. Let me show you a picture of the Denver metropolitan area. And this is color-coded to the number of miles on average that people in each of these different neighborhoods drive on a daily basis. Red is people who drive a lot of miles per day. Green is people who drive very few miles per day, and the color scale in between. And you see very clearly here, people who live in close-in urban neighborhoods on average drive less than people in the suburbs. Not at all surprising. And these data were provided by the Regional Planning Agency in Denver. You could do the same thing really for other metropolitan areas. Folks in Boston have done this, folks in Portland have done this. And you see this very clear pattern, this clear connection between city living and less driving. And then you also see the same thing for walkability. In the past, we've talked about WalkScore. Now, WalkScore is this free web-based tool that lets you compute the walkability of any house, any neighborhood in the United States based on its proximity to about a dozen common destinations that people might walk to: stores, schools, parks, banks, and the like. And again, the map here for Denver shows high levels of walkability in the urban core, relatively low levels of walkability in the more dispersed suburbs. The other thing we know is that when cities have great transit systems that are highly patronized, people don't drive as much. And what this chart shows you is, roughly speaking, the correlation for the 51 largest metropolitan areas between the share of the population that uses transit, that's on the horizontal axis, and the number of miles per person per day. So the better a transit system you have, on average, the less people drive in your city. And that's, again, a characteristic of a city that works well is a good transit system. Same relationship holds for walkability. The more walkable your city is, again, based on this walk score metric that is available for every city, every neighborhood, every house in the United States, the more walkable your city is, the less driving happens in your city. A statistically strong correlation at the metropolitan level. We see the same thing as I showed you in those maps earlier at the neighborhood level. We also see this generational change fueling the adoption of other modes of transit, in particular cycling, which has just exploded in the United States. Now, the American Community Survey is the sample that's collected every year. Basically speaking, we've increased cycling in the United States by about 60% in just the last 6 years. As you all know, it is a big generational shift. And cities are the places where cycling works best. Again, because there are more destinations close at hand. They're typically the well-developed street grids that make cycling easy. They're back streets as opposed to being stuck on major arterials and so on. And the big increases that we see in cycling are particularly in cities that work well. The other thing that we see is the evolution of entirely new and different modes of transportation. Car sharing, where you don't have to own a vehicle to have access to a vehicle. And we know that car share households are much more parsimonious in their use of automobiles than people who own automobiles and use them full time. And there's been, again, very much an explosion in participation in car sharing services in the United States. It went from fewer than 50,000 people engaged in them a decade ago to 1 million people essentially involved in car sharing, or are members of car sharing programs today. And that growth is continuing. And that's another way that cities can reduce the amount of driving that occurs. And again, car sharing is something that works well where you have density, where you have a lot of customers, and where the landscape facilitates easy use and easy access to car sharing. And then the final point that I want to make about cities, and it's a little bit more subtle, I think, is that cities give the opportunity for people to live closer to where they work, to where they shop, to where they recreate, and to other people. And that's something that we see in the behavior of people in housing markets in the United States. These are data from the Census Bureau, which asks people why they move. And one of the questions they ask is, did you move to reduce the length of your commute? And very few people in the early part of the last decade in the United States reported moving to reduce their commute. But there's been a big increase in that over time, and that's probably correlated with this movement of people back into cities. So that's another way that cities can produce these benefits. So there's a whole combination of things, a portfolio of things that cities can do well: transit, walking, biking, car sharing, mixed-use development, and providing opportunities for people to live closer to the things that their jobs and the things that they engage in, so that they don't have to travel as much. So cities really are the solution for earning the green dividend. The final point I want to make today is that there is a special bonus that goes along with the green dividend. And that is that by reducing the amount of driving that we do in the United States, we can actually make huge, huge progress in reducing the problems associated with traffic congestion. And the interesting thing here from an economic perspective is traffic congestion is what we call a nonlinear problem, or a nonlinear characteristic, a nonlinear system. Small changes in the amount of traffic can produce big changes in the amount of traffic congestion. And that's exactly what's going on in the cities where we're seeing reduced driving. Is travel times are going down, congestion is going down, and things are moving more quickly than they did before. Now, how do we know this? Well, let me back up just a second to say, and I'll get to the headline finding, which is the time lost to traffic congestion in the United States in the 50 largest metropolitan areas has declined by about 30% in just the last 3 or 4 years. The biggest measured decline in traffic congestion in the United States in the period of time for which we have reliable and consistent data. Now, how do we know this? We know this because basically every commercial vehicle in the United States is carrying around a GPS device and is connected to a data plan. So all these vehicles, more than 2 million vehicles, are being monitored in real time to know how fast that they're going. There's a company called INRIX in Seattle that essentially aggregates all that commercial fleet data and uses it to compute how fast traffic is moving on every major street in the United States. And then they aggregate that and archive it over time, so that now we have a wonderful time series of how fast traffic is moving on major roads in the United States. And what the INRIX data show is, and they report this in something called the INRIX Index or the INRIX Scorecard, and you can look up the values for your city to see how they're changing over time. We know that travel times in the United States have been declining year over year. The red year there is, I think, 2010, the blue year, 2011, the green year, 2012. You can see the congestion index gradually declining. When you string all those numbers together, the congestion index has gone from about 14 in 2010 to about 7 in 2013. And what that means is an index of 14 meant the average rush hour trip took you 14% longer at the rush hour than it would have during non-peak times. So the time lost to congestion by this measure has fallen for the United States by about half over this period of time. Now you see a little rebound at the end. But what this is showing is that as we reduce driving, and we reduce driving by about 5 or 6% in the United States, there's this disproportionate or nonlinear reduction in congestion, an even bigger reduction in congestion, and an improvement in travel times. So in addition to getting this financial bonus from driving less, the green dividend is accompanied by this traffic bonus, that we get faster travel times, better performance of our travel system, and without having to spend billions of dollars on transportation projects. So the green dividend is really a huge advantage for cities. The market is moving in this direction. There's $31 billion on the table for the nation's cities. If we can reduce VMT, vehicle miles traveled, by just 1 additional mile per person per day, and then we get this wonderful bonus of actually having our traffic system work better and most smoothly than it does. So I hope that the green dividend will give you some ideas about the ways that cities can be solutions and will help each of your communities to move forward. Thanks very much.